So welcome everyone for another webinar in our special seminar series at the System Dynamics Society. Today, we are covering very, very special topic on accelerating sustainability education with System Dynamics, a community-based strategy. And this work presented today is based on a work that has been published in the Nature Sustainability. And I'll leave a link in the chat if you haven't had the chance to read the paper yet. You can go ahead and save it to read later. And I just want to thank all the presenters joining us today, Charles, David, Florian, and Juliette. I'm happy to introduce you guys in a moment. Just want to take a minute to invite you all to join us in Boston this year for the International System Dynamics Conference. And this year's theme is incorporating AI into dynamic modeling. We're meeting in Boston, the Boston University from 3rd to 7th of August. And submissions are open now. You can submit your work to present at the System Dynamics Conference until March 18th. So don't lose this opportunity to present at the biggest conference in the fields. And I also want to take a moment to thank all the society sponsors. It's only through their help that we are continuing able to spread the word about System Dynamics worldwide. And today's essential agenda is more or less 45 minutes presentation for our presenters. And then we will have, by the end of this webinar, a session of Q&A session. And I'm happy to introduce you Juliette Bruni-Varga. She's a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and the director of the Climate Change Initiative. She creates interactive simulations to help people understand and act on climate science. We also have Charles Henderson. He's a distinguished professor at Western Michigan University, where he focuses on understanding and promoting change in higher education. And David Ford, he's the Vesaliu Professor of Construction Engineering and Management at Virginia Tech. His research focuses on exploring the social impacts of natural disasters and community recovery. And finally, we also have Florian Kappmeier, a professor of strategy at the Reutlingen University in Germany. He links system dynamics with empirical research to help organizations understand complexity and address sustainability challenges. Thank you all for being in here and present such a great topic on this research that you guys did. And that's all from my side. I think, Juliette, you're presenting, so you can take over and share your screen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Fernando. Just want to take a moment to express our gratitude for people taking time out of their days to be here with us today. And also would love to see you. If you're able to activate your camera, that would be great. Would love to have as interactive a webinar as possible. And we love seeing your faces. So I just want to say that. And I will go ahead and share my screen. We're going to be using Poll Everywhere today, so we would also love for you to get in on that. So we've already seen the title, and just to get us started and make sure that we kind of have the technology down, which should be pretty straightforward, you can use the this link over here. You can text, or you can use the QR code. Just checking in on where people are tuning in from today, so we have a sense of who have got in the room. We'll give people a moment to kind of sort out the getting online and all that. You don't need to register for credit, obviously, if you get prompted.
Would you please share the link to the poll?
Yeah, absolutely. So the link is also here. Oops, sorry, just sent that. Let me try that one more time.
I got it for you, Juliette. It's in the chat.
Okay, thanks. All right. Great. So we're seeing people from a lot of different places: Binghamton, Spain, Michigan, Massachusetts, Stuttgart, all right, New York. Great. Love it. Germany, I'm assuming. Turkey, Detroit, love to see this. It's really exciting. All right, so Kentucky, love it. Minnesota. Okay, so great. So it seems like we've got the tech pretty well sorted out. We're gonna go on. So as Fernando mentioned, we're happy to share insights from this work, and also hope that it's open access, so it should be easy to take a look at if you're interested. Also just want to acknowledge so many people who were involved in helping us develop the model and really thinking through how the model structure should, how we can represent the reality as much as possible of diffusion or propagation in higher education of educational innovations to create a model structure that reflected that. So we thought we'd also just ask you to start off whether you've used some of these models or whether you've participated in the World Climate or Climate Action Simulation, since that was really one of the main motivators for our work. Is we had a lot of experience developing and using these tools, and we really wanted to see them grow, but we're having trouble having that success happen. And I'm going to pass it on to Florian.
Yeah. Sorry, Juliet. Yeah, so for example, if you can go on with one slide. Yeah, so for example, we just saw that many of you have engaged with C-roads or N-roads. And what have we done is that we have, or Climate Interactive has developed the tools, and then there were engagements, highly interactive modes of such engagements with freely available facilitation and participant materials. For example, with C-roads and the World Climate Simulation on the right, N-roads and the N-roads Climate Workshop and the Climate Action Simulation. And not only have we done this, but we've also tried to do all the right things to support the diffusion. For example, on the next page, we have written peer-reviewed papers and have media coverage. And then there's the MIT Climate Pathways project, with which we want to, next slide, yes, engage leaders with interactive simulations to enhance evidence-based climate policy. And so we've engaged with 18,000 of them worldwide. Next, we have engaged with opinion leaders from which we believe they can spread the word even more. And next slide, there are even awards, international rewards, including from the principles of responsible management education, that two of the tools, so En-ROADS as well as the linked multi-solving idea, is in the best 10 list of climate change education tools. We adopted the simulation materials to diverse educational settings, as you can see here on this slide. And next slide, we have engaged with more than 400,000 people in 170 countries. So doesn't that sound like a success? We should be happy, right? But these 400,000 people are not students. And when we consider that there were in 2020, 254 million undergraduate students worldwide, then this brings it a little bit into perspective, as we have reached less than 1/5 of 1% of the students, if we assume that the 400,000 people were students. So I think we can do much better, right? So Charles, handing over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And so one of the, and so it's not, of course, not just C-roads and In-roads that have this problem. And a lot of the work that I do is studying innovations and spread of instructional ideas in undergraduate STEM education. And so we have learned some things from that I'll tell you about on the next couple of slides. You can go on. And so what we're trying to do is to take this knowledge about the spread of educational innovations and use it to develop system dynamic models. And so these are just a couple of examples from some of the studies that I've done. one of them was in 2017. We tried to find what we called well-propagated named instructional strategies. This is across all undergraduate STEM disciplines. We found 21 of them, which is an incredibly tiny number. In a different study, we looked at funded NSF education development grants, and we weren't trying to judge if they were well propagated. We just wanted to find out if anybody had adopted their products, and only 16% of them did we find evidence that anybody had used the products. So there's substantial problems here. Next slide, please. And the way that we frame the situation is that these problems arise from the typical development and dissemination process, where you have solitary developers that are working in their own context to develop something that might work very well for them, but is not necessarily suited to the needs of others. And then they go and tell people about it using, broadcast methods. And so you get common outcomes. Well, people never try it. They try it and then they drop it because they don't really understand how it works, or they continue using it, but they're using it superficially and are not getting the full impact from it. Next slide, please. And so working on this, we would develop a system dynamics model. And the first thing we wanted to do was to see if we could model what typical practice might look like. And we've got that on the next slide. And of course, we'll show you what it looks like under the hood here in a minute. But this is what you might expect. So you start out with a group of users, probably not as high as is shown here, but and it goes up a little bit while you're actively working on the project, and then it decreases very quickly until it gets down to 0 after some period of time.
Yeah, and I'll just mention that we were starting off with this idea of propagating the simulations that we were interested in, and we did think that, sort of 50 users or so would be appropriate as a starting point, but as Charles points out, this is pretty high. So an optimistic scenario even.
And I think that's back to you, Juliet.
Yeah, so we were asking the question, really starting with Charles' research and with our own experience of how can we do better? And so we thought we would start by asking you, if you could choose one thing out of this set of sort of best practice approaches, what would you do? Would you make the tool easier for instructors to adopt so that they're more likely to use it if they encounter it or if they hear about it? Would you ensure that it's continually updated and kept relevant to them so that if they do try it out, they're more likely to stick with it for a long time? Would you offer a lot of interactive presentations about the tool so that people hear about it and they hear about it in a way that's interactive and effective? Would you run more digital campaigns to share information about it? Or would you make sure that outreach efforts are funded for a longer time so that outreach has a longer time to have an impact? And so it's great to see responses coming in. Maybe give it another moment and then we'll see what the winner is. And it looks like so far we're seeing that people favor the idea of offering more interactive presentations and ensuring that the tool is continually updated and kept relevant. Okay, so those two will go with for now, and make the tool easier for instructors to adopt as another sort of second. Oh, looks like it caught up. So those 3 are the winners. Okay, great. So I thought we would start by testing in the model what happens if we simulate those choices. So this is just a screenshot. I'm gonna go to Vensim where our model is and take a look at, and if we just try, so one of the things that people pushed on pretty hard at first was the increasing the number of interactive presentations, doing more kind of outreach. So what I'm going to do first is just give us at least the initial period of funding. So typically with an NSF project, at least a US National Science Foundation project, we might have something like 4 years of funding. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in so that at least we have something to start with. And you can see that the users are growing as a result of having that outreach effort happening in that initial 4 years. And then let's increase the number of presentations. And that's certainly helping. I want to note that we're going from something like, 90 or so users. So if we keep that in mind, to if we do 12 presentations a year, which is once a month, you're getting on there and doing some kind of a interactive, high quality presentation, we're over 100 before things start to deplete. We also had people suggesting that we should increase the ease of adoption. So let's push on that one. So here we're assuming that from Charles' research and others, we're starting off with about a 5% adoption rate, which is kind of what we expect to see as a baseline. And we're going to make this easier so that more people who hear about the tool are adopting it. And you can see that's helping us grow to a peak of close to 120 users before things start to decline. And then the last thing that people said as a high leverage solution was to make sure that the tool is updated regularly and remains relevant to people users for a long time. And so in that case, we would expect that they would use it for a longer period of time, and we can increase the number of years in which they're implementing the tool. Of course, that's going to require some funding for the developers. So we're just going to increase that a little bit at first. If we were to also say increase the funding, we might have this go up higher. So you can see that that's now reducing the rate at which users are lost. And so that's helping us achieve a higher number and lose them more slowly. So out of those things, well, we'll summarize in our when Florian goes through a sensitivity analysis, but we can see that some of the high leverage things to do are actually to increase the number of years of implementing. And certainly if we're focusing on outreach, I can actually slide this all the way back down to 0. And we can see that even with no outreach at all, if I just have a more rapid ease of adoption and a higher number of years that people actually use the tool, we can get a better outcome. If I add a little bit of outreach, it helps, but it's not going to change things dramatically. I'm going to go back to our slide deck, unless anybody, anything from our team that I should add to that, or are we good?
No, it's great. Thanks, Juliet.
All right. So I think then we start to ask, why do we see this behavior where even in the best case scenario, we're only at about 100 users, and then they start to drop off pretty quickly. And so we start with a simple stock flow structure, which is probably familiar to people in terms of it's very similar to the classic fast diffusion model. We have a stock of potential adopters and a stock of adopters and a flow between them represented as adopting. And what that reflects then is our potential adopters are basically instructors in undergraduate education who teach sustainability or even could be teaching sustainability and using this tool. And I also just want to note that this could also be instructors in other spaces. It clearly doesn't have to be sustainability. The key point here is that these are people who are adopters would be people who are making decisions themselves on whether or not to use the tool. Adopters also quit over time, and there's some structure that will define or capture how those things behave. Okay, so like the classic BAS model, we have a word of mouth reinforcing feedback, which is here. So we have adopters who are interacting with potential adopters through contacts, and some fraction of those contacts decide to adopt, and that leads to adopting through contact with adopters. Of course, at some point, you've reached so many potential adopters that you start to deplete those potential adopters, and so we have a balancing feedback here where potential adopters, there's a limit to how many adopters we can have because of we saturate with potential adopters. So why, I think a lot of us who develop tools for education or for lots of other things assume that if we do a really good job, if our tool is high quality, it will go viral. And the going viral is this word of mouth feedback, right? So people should talk about it, they should share information, it should spread. But we don't see that happening in higher education. And the reason for that is because we have a problem. Those of us who are faculty or instructors in higher ed have a low number of contacts. In other words, we tend to talk to the same people about our work over and over again, or when we're talking to new people, we're often talking about our research, our scholarly work, our innovations, not necessarily about what we do in the classroom. So the number of contacts in which we're actually sharing information about our favorite educational tools is very low. Similarly, when we think about the fraction of adopter contacts who actually adopt, we don't tend to do a very compelling job of convincing people to adopt or supporting that adoption. And so that number also tends to be very low. And these are just the underlying equations for that if you want to dig into it some more. So we're starting though with assumptions of about one person per year where you're really telling somebody about what you're doing, another instructor who could adopt the tool. You're telling them about what you're doing in the classroom in a way that you're trying to share that and spread it. And we assume a relatively low rate of adopters, a fraction of adopter contacts who adopt because it is low. And here it's 10%, which actually may be fairly optimistic. So the other part of this is that as you saw that curve, we're losing people. We're losing people faster than the word of mouth or than a weak word of mouth feedback can keep up with that loss. So adopters are quitting. And you rightly identified this idea of if you stay in that adopter pool for a longer time, if you have a longer period of time where you're using the tool because it's kept up to date, it's kept fresh, it's kept relevant, it's kept high quality, that's actually a fairly high leverage activity in terms of allowing even a weak word of mouth feedback to do at least a better job in building some adopters. So we're starting with a 5-year assumption, which again may be fairly optimistic, but we can extend that in the model and find out what happens. So then we also looked at outreach, right? And you suggested some ideas for outreach. And this is really considered best practice in dissemination of higher education innovations. And in the classic BAS model of diffusion, we see that outreach really helps, primarily because it's seeding this word of mouth feedback. Again, the problem here is that the word of mouth feedback is weak. And so even if you push on outreach really hard, the best thing that you could possibly achieve is like a proportional growth in adopting. You're never going to get to exponential growth because the word of mouth feedback just doesn't take care of that for you. And again, we have underlying assumptions if you want to dig in further. Also, the model is freely available if you want to really dig in. So all of this is to say, like, we need to do something else. What we're doing right now is not working. And especially because if we think about sustainability and systems thinking or other things that we really want to build capacity for rapidly, we need to think about how we can have rapid diffusion occur. So what should we do instead? And what we've done here then is just take this very simple fast diffusion model and extend that further to include a pool of what we're calling ambassadors. So the ambassadors are people who are using the tool very successfully, and they also share their success with others. And I will say that this is really attempting to capture a pretty rarely used, but often successful approach to propagation, which is called community-based propagation. So we're building a community of ambassadors. And so at the beginning of the propagation effort, these ambassadors, we would just consider them to be the developers of the tool. We're assuming that they are ambassadors for their tool. And we have adopters becoming ambassadors through an intentional effort of ambassador development. So we're mentoring them and bringing them into the ambassador pool. And then we also have, of course, ambassadors stepping down. They decide that they've had enough and they quit doing it. here we're just assuming that we have a baseline of about 8 people in that development. Okay, so we thought we'd ask you, what do you think the best strategy would be? And I'll pass this on to Florian.
Right, thank you very much, Juliet. So with so everybody here in this webinar, now it's your turn again. So you've done the exercise before. Now we want to ask you, what do you think, now having in mind that structure on ambassador development, what do you think would be good strategies to bring as many ambassadors in? So for example, A, increase the length of time that community-based propagation efforts are funded. So how long is the financial support for this? Second, and we already have a vote for that, increase the likelihood that mentored adopters become actually ambassadors, so that they're moving from the stock of adopters to the stock of ambassadors. Or C, where that one just disappeared. Support and reward existing ambassadors by increasing the average time they remain ambassadors, so that they keep in the stock of ambassadors. So this is really challenging your systems thinking skills and your stock and flow understanding. Then D, support ambassadors so that they reach more potential adopters, so that they move from the stock of potential adopters to the adopters. Or last one, help ambassadors make it more likely that their contacts adopt to become adopters. So variety of possibilities, of strategies, what can be done. So these are all propagation strategies. It's all in there. Now the question is, what do you want to test? So yeah, only one, and there's one for A and E together. So there's one for A and E, but it seems as if it's B, the increase the likelihood that mentored adopters become ambassadors. That's the winner. And then the last one is help ambassadors make it more likely that their contacts adopt. Julia, do we have enough votes already? I don't see how many have voted.
I think we're good.
Good. So then it's increasing the likelihood that mentored adopters become ambassadors. All right, I think we should test it. So you want to...
Okay, I'm going to go to Venzem.
Yeah, go to Venzem. So it's the support ambassador development, it was, right? Was it the second one, right?
It was increase the likelihood that mentored adopters
become ambassadors.
So we're in over here.
Yes, exactly.
I'm just going to point out that first we're going to turn that switch on for ambassador development.
Mm-hmm.
And even there, we see a little bit of an impact where that initial group of project developers are now trying to bring in some new ambassadors. So here, and Florian, I'll hand it back to you. I don't want to take over, but just want to
it's totally fine. It's totally fine. So, but yes, exactly. So what you see here is that red line, which we haven't seen before, is the group of ambassadors. So this is the group of project developers. It's those who are originally developing the educational innovation. And you see it. So we started out with, I think it is 8. So the initial number of ambassadors. And for now, even though we've activated that substructure now, we don't have anything going on so that adopters are becoming more ambassadors. So we just have this initial pool of ambassadors, and over time they are leaving the project, or they're leaving the project, not committed to it anymore, and move on. So this is why you see that the group of stock of ambassadors is depleting over time. But still, as long as they are ambassadors, now as we've activated that substructure, what are we doing with this? And now you have suggested, so why they are ambassadors, you see here the lever that Juliet just pointed to, the likelihood that mentored adopters become ambassadors. So currently we say that it's that they are working on while they are ambassadors, working on potential adopters so that they move into the stock of adopters. Now, what you want to test is they should do this more. So more actively, more engaging, more support here for those ambassadors. So Juliet, why don't you just pull that lever a little bit to the right? But before Juliet is doing this, simulate in your head what's going on. How do you think these three lines there, the red line of ambassadors, how this will develop? Will this change the qualitative mode of behavior from depletion to maybe more an increase? What will happen to the blue line of the adopters when the likelihood increases to potential adopters becoming more adopters? How big is that impact? And the green line is just showing the sum of the adopters and the ambassadors. So Juliet, why don't you just pull this lever a little bit up?
Sure. And I also just want to point out that in this baseline, because we didn't decide to pull on the years of funded ambassador development, right now that's at 0. So maybe we want to just fund that for a year or two to get started, or you tell me, Florian, what you want.
Why don't we just pull that lever first of the likelihood? So it is, yeah, so exactly. So
Okay,
so it's not really doing a lot. So it's really marginally, right? So I mean, how many potential adopters can you as an ambassador engage with in a year? That is a lot of work, and mostly you're doing this on top of other things. So this is really hard work. So now, why don't you just increase the years of funded ambassador development, Juliet? Yeah. So okay, now we're talking, right? So now we're seeing a change also in the qualitative mode of behavior, right? So she's really pulling the lever all to the max, and you see that now we are in the mode of exponential growth. So obviously now by increasing the years funded ambassador development, we have now switched over or tipped over a tipping point where we have now changed the behavior from growth and depletion that also Charles pointed out in the beginning to exponential growth. Do you want to test anything more, Juliet, or shall we go into the structure and explain and talk a little bit why this is?
Well, I just want to point out here that I've put the years of funded outreach back to 0. So this is even with no outreach at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we're good. We can
yeah, why don't you, I mean, we can do this right away. So before you pull the lever, everybody here in the webinar, now as we are in this exponential growth, what do you think if we, on top of community propagation, have a very long time of funded outreach activities? What do you think? How does this change the behavior as we see it now? Do you think it's a little bit, or it's really a lot? So the exponential growth is going even more. So challenge your mental model. And now I think, Juliet, why don't you just pull the lever?
Sure. So if I go ahead and pull, we can see that we're getting improvements for sure. But it's not an order of magnitude, right? We're going from something like 12,000 to 14,000 users.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So
it's better, but not a huge difference.
Yeah, it's not so much. And it's very similar to what we've seen before when we have combined word of mouth and outreach. It's doing a little bit, but not so much. And the reasons are just very similar. Why don't we just go to the model structure?
Sure. All right. So.
All right. Shall I?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so ambassadors here on the right. So the idea, one more time, is to share the innovation with potential adopters on the far left and mentor the adopters, the stock of adopters in the middle, so that they become ambassadors. So that's the idea of the ambassadors. So what they're doing is, what the ambassadors are doing is that they are creating and strengthening two reinforcing feedbacks, which you see the first one below is R2, community propagation, and the second in the upper right, R3, community building. So they are generating that exponential growth in adopters and ambassadors that you've just seen. And they are, this community propagation and these activities, they generate the exponential growth in the stock of adopters and in the stock of ambassadors, as long as these activities are active. So therefore, the years funded ambassador development, so TFAA, they're in green, this is really critical. So the longer the time, that's what we've just seen, the longer the time of the funded ambassador development, the longer these reinforcing loops are active. And the longer they are active, the more users are using the innovation over time. But then when the funding stops, and ambassadors do not step down immediately, but only after some time, which is why the pool of adopters first increases before it decreases. So they are moving from the stock of ambassadors to the stock of adopters, which is why we see in the simulation an increase in the stock of adopters after the years of funding development is going down. So, and then over the longer, so you see here the equations for adopting through ambassadors and adopting adopters becoming ambassadors through ambassadors, and the parameter assumptions. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit more in a moment. So, but the takeaway here is over the longer term, the impact of community building strategies enables the scaling of the innovations at a level that far exceeds the potential of word of mouth and outreach. And Charles is giving us some insights about how this plays out in reality.
Yeah, and so just really quickly, this model is also consistent with what we found in the real world in undergraduate STEM education innovations. If you remember, the typical thing that people did was their solitary development and passive or mass market dissemination strategies that tend to be ineffective. What we found in the very small numbers of educational innovations that have been well propagated, they use more of these community models. So we have what we often talk about as collaborative development. So rather than developing something in your own situation that fits your needs, you work with other people to make sure that it fits a broad set of needs. In dissemination, you work with communities, groups of people to really interact with them and understand what some of the barriers to using this innovation are. And then there's this extra stage of support. One of the things that we find very often is, of course, when somebody tries a new thing for the first time, it doesn't usually go very well. And so these strategies that provide some mechanism of support, often through a community, are much more likely to help users get over that initial hump and become successful users. So anyway, the point is that this system dynamics model that we've created is actually consistent with results that we know from actual educational research.
But still, while we were exploring the model, we acknowledged that we worked with high uncertainties in the assessment of parameter values. So while Charles and his team, for example, they have explored this, data are very, there's not much data on this. So therefore, we wanted to understand the impact of the different parameters a little bit better. Juliet, you can click now through. So we want to test full range of possible values for the poorly constrained parameters next, and investigate how parameters affect model outcomes and identify the high leverage parameters. Why? Because of two things. Pause here, Juliet. So the high leverage parameter identification is interesting for two groups of people. First, interesting for policy. So when money is given to help spreading such a educational innovation, resources are put into this, invested in this. But these resources are scarce. So we need to understand which ones are the high leverage parameters to justify shifting these scarce resources towards the high leverage policies, activities. And second, it's also interesting for research if we, because if varying the parameter has little impact, further research on understanding that parameter is not necessary. We need to understand which ones are the ones with high leverage impact so that we understand better how we can achieve this. So now, how are we doing this? So we have assumptions here in the model. Just continue now through. So the ranges for parameters that can be influenced by the propagation efforts. So we distinguished between can it be influenced or not, and go on. And the parameter ranges we identified because of how they are based on prior research and our team understanding of the system. So continue. We did two types of sensitivity analysis, univariate sensitivity analysis for each parameter, continue, and multivariate sensitivity analysis to assess the combined effects of varying the parameter values. And continue one more time, please. And we simulated the model 200 times with independent randomly selected parameter values from uniform distributions with their specified ranges. Now, how we are showing this is with violin plots. And maybe you've seen these violin plots and maybe not. So therefore, I'm just very quickly showing, explaining how these can be read. Thank you. So Sun is bringing me something to drink. It's very kind. So on the left-hand side, you see the parameter name and the abbreviation. On the lower, the x-axis is the number of users in the year 15. So after, right. And then you will see the white dot here in the middle of that figure. That's the median value. And the big bar is the 95% confidence interval. And then the thin black vertical line is the interquartile range. And what is new here and is adding is the rotated cardinal density plot is the probability density of the distribution around this. So that's how you read these violin plots. Okay, now first we tested the parameters that affect the base case. And so the base case is word of mouth. We have 4 parameters that are important here. And what you see is that there are 2 parameters stick out that have more influence on the outcome, the number of users after 15 years, than the 2 others. And continue with the animation. It is the average number of years of the implementation and the number of contacts per adapter. So it's TA and CA. It is the 2 parameters that affect the reinforcing loop. No surprise, right? Because these 2 would drive the exponential growth. But still, it is limited in terms of the number of users in the year 15. So now we've tested, as the next one, we've tested word of mouth and outreach. And so we're adding out word of mouth to the outreach. And now you see on the left-hand side that there are more parameters that are important here. And still, when we look for the 2, or when we look at them, it's 2 parameters that stick out. And again, it is TA and CA. It's the 2 parameters that drive the reinforcing loop that are also important here for the word of mouth and outreach activities. But this here stops after 4 years. Now, when we extend the time horizon of the outreach activities, then again, it is TA and CA. And look, there's one more. It is the number of attendees per presentation, which were interestingly not so important when we look at the shorter activity funding compared to the longer activity funding, because it's another balancing loop that pushes then the reinforcing structure of word of mouth. But still, the number of users is not very high. So we are here in the range of, if everything works out fine, at 380. Now, strategy 2, where we add community propagation, and you see that now we're talking. So now we are increasing the number of users to 1,200 almost. And which ones are the important parameters that we have identified? It is TA again. Okay, TA is coming around the corner all the time. And in addition, it is the fraction of ambassador contacts through Adopt and the number of contacts per ambassador. That is the second reinforcing loop. So it's the first, it's word of mouth reinforcing loop, TA, and then the second reinforcing loop that is actually pushing it. But still here, we are only doing it for 4 years. Now, when we extend the time for community propagation to 15, now pay attention, the scale now on the x-axis is different. Whereas for 4 years, the maximum is at 1,400. Now the maximum is at 80,000. So in its CAA and FAA, both the parameters that drive the second reinforcing feedback are two. That is so important. Now, next slide shows strategy 3, where we have word of mouth and community propagation. And you see that it's so without outreach, and you see it's very similar. You can continue. It is still TA, FAA, and CAA, which are critical for the dissemination or propagation of the education innovation. Now, when we move on to the multivariate sensitivity analysis, where we're assessing the combined effects of varying parameter values on users at the end of the year 15. On the left hand, you see word of mouth is the base case, and then strategy 1A and B is word of mouth and outreach. Strategy 2B and 2A is word of mouth, outreach, and community building. And strategy 3A and B is just word of mouth and community building. And you see that, and there are two, yes, exactly. Community-based propagation strategies show greater potential for generating users by year 15 than outreach alone. So that's strategies A and B, or the base case, even when it's only done for 4 years. So the main takeaway is, next animation, please, Juliet. All as combination of input parameter values are varied, community-based propagation strategies have greater potential and are more likely to yield greater numbers of users than outreach alone. David.
Thank you. Go ahead and start through the animations. So let's step back for just a moment and look at what we've learned through building and using this model in our interrogation of this model, and then talk a little bit about what does this mean for building and disseminating these tools. So in the beginning, we showed that we tend to be weak in our contact and contagion part, and therefore these things don't sort of go viral on their own. Go ahead, next and next. We investigated looking at the traditional approach, which is outreach, and what we found is, yeah, it bumps it up, but it doesn't make the big impact. Remember our initial question, how could we get to 1 million or a very large number of students? And outreach alone, meaning what we've been doing, doesn't get us there. Next. What we found and what both Juliet and Florian have been showing with the model is building these communities of ambassadors is a way in which we can greatly scale up our dissemination. And one way to interpret what Florian was just talking about from the sensitivity analysis is the high leverage parameters, the ones that were making the big impact, were the ones that were building and then supporting the communities of ambassadors. So that includes things like increasing how long people, faculty members, remain in the adopter pool, which then, of course, helps feed the ambassador pool. That's one of our high leverage activities. So one of the things that this suggests is that if we have limited resources to build these disseminations, that what we should be doing is using our limited resources to build these communities, what we called ambassadors, versus some of how we've been using the money before. Next slide. Go.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
we good?
Yeah.
So what we've seen is lots of attempts at diffusion, as many of us who've been funded and worked on these sorts of things have seen, but they're usually not very successful. One of the reasons is because we're calling on individuals to make that adoption decision without a lot of support. Go ahead. So that our reinforcing word of mouth feedback loops tend to be weak. Part of what we saw in the sensitivity analysis is how if you can strengthen that word of mouth feedback loop, you can do better and better. So one of the key questions is, how do we do that? And one of the key learnings of this research is that building and supporting communities of ambassadors is a way to strengthen that word of mouth loop. But we do have barriers, and therefore we need some meaningful change that can sometimes meet with resistance. Go ahead. So what does it take? One thing that it takes is intentional effort to build these communities. These communities need to do several things. They need to share what they have with others. It's a part of being that community, sharing materials, sharing experiences, and sharing support. How does that help us? It helps us by creating more opportunities to create more adopters. When we build the community of ambassadors, we build and increase the rate at which adopters become ambassadors. We need to do this in ways that are compelling and make adoption by potential adopters more likely. And ambassadors are uniquely or better able to do that than people who are just adopters. So there's another reason or mechanism by which the ambassadors help. The ambassadors also mentor the adopters so that they become ambassador. And this creates sort of a new kind of relationship. We already have relationships in which we want adopters to help potential adopters adopt. What we are recommending is that we need adopters who are actively mentoring ambassadors who are actively mentoring adopters to become ambassadors. Next. So that part of what's needed is support and reward for ambassadors' work. As I believe it was Florian who said, this isn't easy stuff. If you've tried to do this, if you've tried to be an ambassador for one of your tools or something, it takes a lot of effort. And therefore, part of what's needed is support and rewards for these ambassadors so that they find it rewarding enough that they want to continue doing that and help them to then stay ambassadors long enough and do these activities which we've been talking about. Next.
So okay, so just zooming out for a moment and really we're ready for questions. I think we've talked a little bit longer than maybe we've got a little bit over. I think one of the things that we've asked ourselves is, are there other systems that are similar where we can use this understanding of really building community-based propagation approaches and leverage that to have rapid diffusion? And so I just thought we would ask, you all, if you have any thoughts about that. And also we're happy to share some examples where we are using that approach or where we see that approach as being important. And again, just to emphasize, the key systemic structure is bottom-up decision-making. So individuals need to be making their own decisions about whether or not to adopt. We have a case, you need to have a case where the word of mouth feedback is going to be weak. So people are not likely to talk about the thing and not likely to talk about it in a way that's convincing. And it needs to be possible to form a community of ambassadors. And so that's something too that, really thinking about it as an academic, we have to think about how can we collaborate more? How can we work more in a more coordinated way, in a more collaborative way to make these kinds of things happen? But there are many other systemic structures or many other problems with similar systemic structure that where it's possible to form a community, but it takes intention. It takes focus and resources. So yeah, so I think public health programs could be a great example where if more people know about the behavior or the action that you can take to be more healthy, or to, you know, whether it's I don't know what this person who had this in mind was thinking, but I can think of healthy diets, vaccination, avoiding getting infected or passing on infectious disease. Many of those are linked to behaviors. And spreading that behavior rapidly is something that you might not want to talk about with somebody. You might not do compellingly, but you can imagine building a community of people who are committed to the thing. I see EAP adoption, which I know what that means because I'm in on that project. It's energy efficiency program adoption. So I'm happy to talk about that too. EV adoption, another one. So these are things that, yeah, adoption of, yes, the balconies of the PV plants. Those are great in Germany. I've seen those as well. So something where the thing that you're trying to spread needs to spread quickly, but you can't do it through a top-down decision. And it may not be like the sexy topic to talk about, right? It might not be the thing that people want to talk about on their own. So these are great examples. And I'm happy to, with a couple of minutes left, answer questions. I just want to also, just because I love this image, just leave you too with our work using this approach to spread energy efficiency program participation amongst environmental justice communities. And this is a social network analysis showing the ambassadors in those small red dots reaching out to people in their community and spreading the word about energy efficiency programs. And yeah, with that, just happy to take questions or thoughts.
Thank you, Juliet. I just want to thank you guys for the presentation and just reinforce here that the questions you might be able to just leave in the chat, the questions. I've seen that people have been asking a few questions, and Florian and others have been answering a few of them. And I can help moderate a few questions if you want to. We have really just a few minutes, but I see David put here in the chat, Juliet, if you guys want to respond, if you know, how does adoption vary institution type in the US context? Our wonderful
Charles,
professor.
Yeah, I was just gonna try to type a response, but it doesn't vary very much. You know, all the higher ed institutions have similar lack of care about teaching methods, I guess is one way to put it. And you know, they're for different reasons at a big research university versus, say, you know, 2-year community college. But it's still these same situations happen at all types of institutions. So we haven't seen a big difference. There is a lot more education research going on at big research universities, so that makes them more likely to use it. But it's not because they've heard about it from somewhere else. It's because the education developer is at that school, because that's where people that do research is at the research universities. So that's the short answer.
Yeah.
I looked through.
I also just want to mention. I also just want to mention that Lucia Cheney on our team did that social network analysis, even though she's not presenting today. Of just gratitude to her and her work. And yeah, sorry, Florian, go ahead.
Yeah, I looked through the comments. I didn't see so many other questions. Saw that Hubert was asking, so which of the 5 options would be best? I think we've addressed this through the sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, and just to kind of hammer that one home, I think the main thing there is to shift resources, right? From outreach. If you only have limited resources, shift them from outreach to intentional community propagation. Like that's kind of the big take home. Yeah, Florian, go ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that there are more questions. So if anybody has a question, why don't you just raise your hand and open up the mic?
Let me see, what is the need being met for adoption? Yeah. So, and this question from Stephen Smith, what is the need being met by adoption? I mean, in our case, we're talking about educational innovations for sustainability, right? So that was what drove our process. Like drove our motivation for developing this model. But
That's your motivation. What's the motivation for the users?
yeah. So in that case, it's a great question. In that case, it would be the need to teach about sustainability or the desire to teach about sustainability or whatever, because obviously this applies to other spheres as well. But you raise a great point. I mean, you need to, I mean, I think if I'm understanding your point correctly, that if you don't have a need that's being met, it's not going to, right, you're not going to have adoption.
And it might be a grandfathering situation where the need is actually the student. So what's driving the students to use it to mean the educators find value in it because they're seeing value for their students, which means they're coming to you. So how does it switch from you doing a tell and a push to it being a pull system where they're pulling this as a useful tool?
Part of that is how we develop the tool so that it is attractive and easy to use and such, so that Juliet focuses on climate. I'm in engineering. I'm in a construction program, but there is this great awareness of the need to bring climate and climate change and impacts and such programs like this into our teaching, even though we're not focused on those. And so that having tools like this that are easy for the instructor to use to bring into the classroom and are attractive to the students. I don't have any problem in having my students think that climate and environment is an important topic. But having those characteristics is great facilitators of helping the diffusion into the broader educational realm, I would suggest.
Yeah, and I guess
So
just to
have you
back
got
up, Stephen.
evidence for that? So I'm coming at this from a very different background. So I'm an agile coach and I work in banks. So I'm more interested in the systems dynamics side. But I know that, for example, to actually get a community to actually interact with your product and get this word of mouth, and we've built agile communities in the past, you need to have the need filled. And I think people will learn. I'm making a hypothesis here. People will want to know about the model. They'll know the model exists, but they don't have a reason to use the model because they know the answer. The answer is we're in trouble. So what's the reason? I'm sort of pushing it because I think it's quite important. Why were you users using it? Not as just part of an academic course. Why? Okay, because I saw Vensim 20 years ago and it would do all the modeling, but it wasn't a useful tool. And ultimately it was difficult to model. So why would they use this? I'm sorry if I'm pushing, I'm trying to be helpful.
No, it's great. I love it. So just to back up so that I understand what you're saying, Stephen, like I feel like there's a couple of things that you could be asking. One could be, why would you use the educational innovation? The other is, why would you use our model to try to guide a propagation strategy? Can you clarify which one of those things you're trying to ask about?
Let's say both.
Okay, so then I'll start with the first one. I think with the first question, like, why would you use the educational innovation? That's a great question. And I think clearly, like, the word of mouth is not going to get you there. Like, right, we see evidence that trying to convince your colleagues, like, let's say that what's happened in our team is several of us have used these simulations. We're like, wow, these are fantastic. There's huge educational impact. We want to bring them into our classroom, and we go ahead and do it. But we know that word of mouth is not going to drive that. So in this model that we've shown you today, we're starting with the assumption that the thing that we're developing, the thing that we're trying to spread, not the model we're developing, but the thing that we're trying to spread is a useful tool for educators. If it's not, I think you're not going to have any hope propagating it anyway. So kind of the baseline assumption is that there's a high quality tool. It meets a need that educators have. In this case, the need is to teach students, in our specific case, it's the need to teach students about climate change and climate mitigation, but it could be something else. I mean, in Charles' case, it's much more focused on teaching students about physics. So the baseline assumption is that it meets the need. as far as the model is concerned, I think the insights from the model are useful if you're in a situation where you're trying, maybe more like your situation, I don't know too, might be fairly similar, where you're trying to spread something that you know is useful, that you think needs to scale rapidly, but you have a weak reinforcing, weak word of mouth feedback loop. In other words, it's not going to spread on its own. It's not going to spread without an intentional community of ambassadors. And that's where we think this, like the insights from this model are useful, if that makes sense.
And I would also add,
Yeah, no,
it might be a situation where it's difficult to, it's outside of the norm, and so you need some community support to do it. I mean, it's kind of like going to the gym, right? Nobody needs to be convinced that it's probably a good thing to do, but it's easier if you're going to meet your buddy at the gym than if you just have to go on your own, right?
but from my gut says your model's correct. It was more there was a lot of talk of you needing to do this and because you believe in it. And what I'm trying to say is I'm coming out from the other angle of a user and what's useful to them. And if you want to tap into you think this is really useful, make it useful to them rather than be about you. So it's more about your stance rather than necessarily your result. I'm sure the product's good and functional and everything else. It's more about, I was hearing the stance, which was you need to push it. If you push something, you're not going to get a community. You want that community to pull it in. So, and to do that, you need the need from the community, and you need to identify that. And you've listed a few things that are potential hypotheses, which is this is a useful tool, this is that. What you could potentially do is actually test those hypotheses and find out the answers, which is a method of doing that is lean startup, which is also my question. But I seem to be dominating, so apologies. I'm going to leave the floor to someone. I think Prachi had a good comment.
So we have two. Lynn has his hand up, and then there is Prachi. Is Prachi still here? Oops.
Okay, if I could. First of all, question is your sole focus on the education system?
Our focus for this model was on the education system, and specifically on, our focus was on higher ed and sustainability, innovations and sustainability related education.
Right.
So in other words, like that's partly how we parameterized, different values, different variables in the model.
Right.
But having said that, it could be with different numbers, right? It could be more broadly applicable to other systems.
Well, I want to come back to, so you're really trying to get people to embrace the value of En-ROADS as a tool for helping community-based activities to address climate change and sustainability issues.
Yeah, not quite. So I would say that the idea of propagating En-ROADS and other related simulations sparked our interest in this research, but it's not about trying to, we're not specifically trying to propagate En-ROADS. It's much more general. And we're not trying to say that this thing will, the community here, the word community is a little bit confusing because the community refers to the educators who are ambassadors who are using the tool, or
right.
the experts. In the case of Stephen's work, it's not about like bringing, climate action or sustainability work mitigation to a community, and if that makes sense.
Okay, I guess I'm partly picking up on Stefan's idea, but we've got a situation where apparently people think there's actually a climate emergency on the table. And, I'll go back to my use of the word community being, the towns and things like that across the country and beyond. And I did teach stakeholder engagement, sustainability, and systems thinking at a university for 7 years. And it was a master's level program. And what I had students do is, 50% of their mark was on proving that they understood the concepts, and 50% of the mark was on take this idea, take it to a real world and situation and apply it. And the people you were doing this for, they got 10% of the mark. So there was some incentive there. But I'm thinking in terms of, because I guess my sense of the opportunity is maybe a little bit different in the sense that, are you really needing to target the more traditional education program, or do you need to target people like economic developers across the country? So because communities are the ones who are bearing the cost of climate change, and we need to get, I'm a big fan of En-ROADS, and we need to get it out there. So not only is it useful from an educational perspective, but there is real economic value if you get a community to understand that there is opportunity for them to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Yeah, 100% agree with you that there is a need for rapid diffusion of En-ROADS and other tools, not just En-ROADS, right? To make a difference in the real, like outside of education in terms of decision making, in terms of economics, in terms of climate action, a climate emergency. 100% agree. So I think there are lessons learned here that we are translating into those other systems. So our initial motivation, the paper that we wrote, was focused on the educational system. Since then, my team has moved on, and I mentioned Lucia, who was on earlier. So my team at UMass Lowell, we've moved on to using the same approach, as I mentioned, to propagate energy efficiency incentives. So what that is about is we are engaging communities, and actually in this case, it's we're working with an immigrant community, Cambodian American community in Lowell, Massachusetts, where what we see is we have very strong incentive programs for people to insulate, weatherize their home, get heat pumps, all these things that are climate actions, right? They're cutting emissions, cutting energy costs, decarbonizing. But people who would benefit the most from those programs, and a lot of these programs provide these things for free or at greatly reduced cost. But the people who would benefit the most from them tend to use them the least. They don't trust them, they don't know about them, they're not able to use them because of English language isolation, et cetera. At the same time, a lot of these communities have very strong existing social networks. So what our approach is doing is saying, let's not create a new community, let's not create a new social network. Let's take existing social networks, existing ambassadors, people in the communities who are leaders, who have a lot of contacts, and let's make it easy for them to share information about these energy efficiency programs and see if we can accelerate adoption. So that's one example of where we're taking the same, like the insights from the systemic structure to try to translate directly into action on climate rather than just talking about education. I mean, I think education is critically important, which is why I'm doing it. But of course, we also need action today. We can't wait for students to be taking action in the real world later. I'll also just mention that, sitting here in the United States with everything that we're seeing happening at the federal level right now, another system that comes to mind for me is rapidly expanding a social movement to strengthen democracy, right? And again, it's something where you have low reinforcing feedback, weak reinforcing feedback loop from word of mouth, because people have good reasons not to want to open their mouths about it. And so there's relatively low so there's lots of other cases, in the chat we saw public health. I think there's lots of other examples where these same insights translate into things that are not going viral on their own. And you just need to think about the key parts of it. Like, how do I build a community of ambassadors and sustain them and make their work easier? And hopefully leverage existing social networks. Those are things that are on my mind for sure. And I've talked a lot, so I'm going to shut up. Any other questions or thoughts?
I'm going to have to interrupt
we're
you
well
guys.
over time.
Yeah, we are over time. I'm late for a meeting, but this discussion was very insightful, so I wanted to continue here. But I really want to have just to thank you, Juliet, Charles, David, and Florian, to being here today, and thank everyone for joining and for the really great questions and discussion we just had. And I look forward to see you all at the conference, hopefully in Boston.
In Boston. Yeah. Thank you.
That's nearby. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys.
No,
Bye-bye.
thanks everybody. Bye. Thanks,
Ciao, ciao.
Anthony.
Bye bye.